Associate Professor of Philosophy at Manipal University, Jaipur. Along with this, she volunteers as the Chief Editor for a philosophy website called barefootphilosophers.org, which was initiated by her mentor, Dr. Sundar Sarukan. She holds a PhD in Environmental Philosophy from the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. Her research interests include environmental philosophy and humanities, conceptualization of nature in Indian thought, gender studies, interfaith dialogue, cultural geography, and ethics of social media. She has authored the book Nature in Indian Philosophy and Cultural Traditions, published by Springer in 2015. She has also published on rituals and sustainability, religion studies, landscape deities, and ecological practice in the Himalayas. Currently, she is researching on Indian philosophical concepts related to the body through the framework of gender, place, ritual, and aesthetic traditions. Apart from her interest in ecological issues, she's also keenly working on the emerging field of cyber ethics or internet ethics. She's also a member of two international platforms and groups, globalethics.net and also the Consortium of Environmental Philosophers. Professor Meera today will present some insights on body, liberation, and the social through women philosophical poets. Professor Meera, over to you. Nice to have you.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be talking back at MAHE. My PhD is actually from MAHE, though I did it in National Institute of Advanced Studies, and I was with MAHE for a large part of my career. So the way I can only address all of you people is Namaskar Sahridayan. All of you are my Sahridaya, and yeah, I'm so happy to collaborate with Srini on this wonderful event, and it's high time. We have been thinking about this for a long time, and we've been having these wonderful discussions in various fora during every time we met and online. And I think it is a wonderful idea, suggestion of Neetaji, and I will work on it and see that we will bring out something related to women philosophers within the next few years. And since Geetesh ji also has agreed, I think I can invite a lot of us to reflect on different aspects of women philosophers. It's been my passion to look for women philosophers in India, and the passion has only been growing much more. So there are some things that I would, in today's presentation, I'm going to answer in some way questions raised by both Geeta and Srini in there, and as well as the Honorable Vice President in their opening remarks, because first of all, where are the women philosophers? Are they missing? Because if they're there, at least in Indian traditions, where are they? The second question is, why are they all mystics? Why can't we find a text written by an Indian philosopher? Why can't we find somebody, Nyaya Manjari Krita, something by some, Shushila or whoever? Where are the missing texts? And the third question we often ask is the question because in Indian philosophy, excuse me, in Indian philosophy, we always had this idea that, give me a minute. Sorry, some interruption. So the question that we want to ask is there a way in which we can work through understanding women philosophers in both their social contexts in which they existed, because it's the patriarchy, and it is also the question of what is their connection to liberation? Because a lot of these texts which were written during the ancient times were religious in nature also. They were philosophies that were meant for moksha or liberation. So it is, before even we start looking at rational thought from Indian philosophers, we can start working from the kind of sources we already have. And the easiest sources for us are the poet saints of India who have worked on their own liberation. So there are questions about the text, the source, the methodology, how do we study? So I would like to start by presenting my views on this. It's still, my work is in its very initial stages. My first work, which is published, is called Journeys to Elsewhere. It was a conference in Canada where I talked about why the poet saints all became wanderers or roamers, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The second is about women and bodies, and that is my presentation today, Women, Body and Their Works. So with your permission, kind permission, Priya, if I can share my screen, will you enable screen sharing for me, please? And I will share my screen just to keep the talk a little organized and draw your attention to the topic that I'm talking about.
Sure, ma'am. Just give me a minute.
Yeah,
So
I think I can because I'm inside Manipal.
Okay. Please,
Yeah, can you see my
we
screen?
can see your screen, ma'am. We can see your screen. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So my talk today is about liberation and the social, and it's about women poet philosophers in India. Very strangely, this topic was presented in Kenya. I've never presented it in India. It's also getting published as a paper in one of the books, which is to come out on interfaith topics of women and liberation. But I thought I'll talk about this, right? So with Maitri in the background, whom a lot of work, Geetesh also spoke about her, Neeta also spoke about her. This Maitri, I tend to call as a, she's lucky, basically. Her social is very lucky. She's married to an enlightened man and also a feminist man. So I guess this talk can be called as a husband-wife intimate talk. I'd like to think of it as a pillow talk, right? Like Yajnavalkya and Maitreyi are resting after the day's work, and they are in their own chamber, and then he just mentions to her that I'm going to give you, I intend to go away for a long time, and I'll divide the property between you and my other wife, Katyayani. And then she says she's probably been listening in at the doors or when serving the people of the ashram. She's heard a lot of conversations and she has been reflecting on that. She has not done the Shravana only when Yajnavalkya is speaking, I guess. She has done the Shravana throughout her life as she was picking up. So this kind of gives you an idea. So when you look at Maitreyi, the first thing you think is, oh, she went after liberation and Yajnavalkya told her this. You get the idea of a student, but you also get a background. When we are doing work on women philosophers, we sometimes have to listen to the silences in the text. We have to listen carefully because what is not said perhaps reveals more about the social. And the social is what reveals the philosophy of these people. So Maitreyi is our first self-learner. You know, she has been, the point is that we see her asking the question in the Upanishad. But how is she asking that question? Obviously, she has been listening. There's a lot of Shravana that she has been doing. And believe me, if you look at the duties of an ashram wife, she's almost like the entire hostel warden, come cook, come administrative and transport manager of an ashram, because Yajnavalkya's ashram apparently had a large number of cows, and we know that from he had a huge establishment. He must have had a university, and running that university, with due apologies to our vice chancellor, I think she was the vice chancellor, the pro chancellor, all of it in one. I think he was the teacher, the faculty. I'm sure there must be having a lot more faculty teaching different kind of things. So she is the head of a university, the executive head of a university. And obviously, we can picture her there in the ashram, managing a lot of things. Sometimes she reminds me of, with due apologies, Neeta ma'am, you also do that. You manage a huge department and large number of things. So all the women leaders are like Maitreyi for me. And Maitreyi has not been just doing these jobs. She's also been obviously supported by Katyayani. I guess Katyayani would have been the more sort of proctor kind of person, managing trouble. I like to think of these as imaginations from the silences. There's nothing about this in the text itself. There is no textual source. There's no pramana for this. But there is an imagination. There's a pramana of imagination. There's a pramana of dramatization of the situation. There's an anumana of the situation that Maitreyi would have been in. And to ask the question, sir, if you give me all this property, my dear husband, will I get moksha? She should have heard about moksha. She should know that there's something behind. So obviously, she has been lending a ear. She has been doing self-learning. She has been listening in on classrooms. She has been having conversations with people. And at the right opportunity, when she gets the chance, she is directly requesting for tuition from her husband. Like, now you tell me. You have taken class for all your students. Now I demand a class from you. Aap mera class le lo. Please take my class. And so Maitreyi for me is not only a person who says who's kind of asking the question that she's asking, but there is a whole lot of things behind that question. And obviously from our own scriptures, we know that athatho brahma jignasa, for me, the example of athatho is Maitreyi, because her brahma jignasa comes after atha. So all the qualities that our learned Madhvacharya and Shankaracharya and Ramanuja have written about Atha, that is after this, then the question about Brahman, after what Maitreyi for me represents it. She must have had all those qualities that are required for her to force, literally make Yajnavalkya give her the knowledge of the Brahman. She represents for us the ideal seeker, the ideal knowledge seeker, the self-learner who is now ready to get her, PhD. In that question of, so that is why when you go and ask that question, that is why Yajnavalkya doesn't answer Gargi in the court, but he answers Maitreyi. Because obviously there's something in Maitreyi that Yajnavalkya is forced to acknowledge, saying, my wife is ready for this knowledge. So it is an ethical stance, and it is also a stance of what Maitreyi was beyond what is given in the text. And I think when we research women philosophers, if we pay attention to the social, if we start reimagining or reimaging the social that they are present in, I think we will understand not only the situation from where their philosophies emerge, but also we can make sense of their lives. In a text I have on the Bhakti Saints by Vasudha Narayan, she actually says that women philosophers, we don't find texts written by them. We find poetry, we find different kinds of poems, songs, mentions, stories, gathas, folklore, dramas. And so where do we look for the women philosopher text? And in a very different way, we should say the text for women philosophers is their life. Their life itself becomes a living text. And that is where we have to source it. Their life experiences, their very stories become a text for us to study. Their philosophy is their life. Gandhiji did not say, my life is my message. These women philosophers have said that long ago. And I think if we start to look at their life, their poems, their life becomes a living philosophy for us to emulate, follow, model, research on. This is because of the absence of text. Second, because many of the texts that are women philosophers are written by male philosophers. So men write down what women said, and we're not very sure whether they wrote down exactly what the women said, because whenever I give my husband my grocery list, it is slightly altered. So obviously the exact copy down of what women said could have been modified by the men. So we don't even know the authenticity of whether women actually said it. But somewhere in a sense, we will accept that these women, including Vyasa, recorded the conversations of women in the exact way they wanted to, by giving them a lot of space to speak for expression. So Maitreyi, the first one, is the self-learner. And from her life, we learn what it is to ask the question at the right time, what it is to ask the question after due preparation, what it is to learn yourself and at the right time force knowledge, get the knowledge from the apta, from the right teacher. How do you approach a guru and where do you get it? And the guru might not be just somebody in a big ashram or something. The guru can be somebody very close to you too. So that is Maitreyi. That is her social, and her liberation. The second case that I'm talking about is Meera. Now, all we have about Meera is a wonderful folk story. All of us know she was married and she was widowed and she refused to sit down and become a domestic princess. Meera comes from a privileged family, obviously she's a Rajput princess, but from the strict era of Parda system. So Meera's liberation comes from her refusing to bow down to the philosophy, bow down to the traditions of her society. And we find in her poetry dissent and rebellion, in her songs. So she probably didn't pick up a pen and paper and write down, but she sang her life. And in her, though her main study, we can study her as a Bhakti poet and we can study her as a Dvaita philosopher. She's a Dvaita philosopher. She's as eloquent about her love for Krishna. She's known to have talked about the genderlessness of God. Forget the genderlessness of Atman. She literally talks about the genderlessness of both God as well as of bhaktas. Because remember the story where she goes to a teacher and the teacher refuses to meet her because she's a woman, and she says in front of Krishna, who is not a woman? So in that sense, she is a voice for genderlessness of the liberation. But I would like to draw your attention to how then if Meera's poetry is there, at least we have a text we can refer to. Now, one of the ways we can do is we can treat her as a mystic and look at her bhakti, but we can also look at her dissent, and in between her poetry, in the lines of her poetry are hidden some very subtle points of politics, subtle points of action, subtle ethical points. Okay, for instance, take this one sentence that I'm really fascinated about, should be there in every political science textbook. Because right there in that century, she says, Raja रूठे nagari rakhe, hari रूठे kahan jaun. So if you're a mystic, you will read the last line. You pay attention to the last line, say, Hari rute kahan jaun. If God gets angry with me, where can I go? Because the entire universe is his. That is a mystical interpretation of Meera, which has already been done. You can talk about bhakti for hours. It is to be well appreciated. But the line preceding that, Raja rute nagari rakhe. If the king gets angry, the city will take care of me. In this is a very important fact of Indian social at that time. If the king is angry, the city will keep me. Literally says that the king has no power over me because the citizens of a city are more powerful than the king and they will protect me. And she is making a point there about the social that she lived in. The king is not more powerful than its citizens. The citizens are capable of protecting, are capable of opposing the king. There is a theory of descent and process right there in Meera's verses, apart from the mystical. So similarly, so Karna fakiri fir kya diligiri sada magan mein, koi din banglo ni, koi din gaadi ni, koi din. When she's singing of this wandering, she is actually opposing the stability of a settled life. She is saying that a wandering life is as legitimate for women. Women should travel. Women should move around. She's making a case point for women traveling all around. She's saying that. So what we also notice that to travel around, Meera had to become a fakir. The freedom of the body and the social liberation only comes to these women when they reject the domestic. Because in Meera also sings that I left my sasuma. I did not listen to my devar. I left that house of mine. So in some way, for the women of this, the reason they are all mystics is perhaps because they rejected the domestic, and only when they reject the domestic, including Maitreyi, I don't want herds of cattle and tracts of land. That is when they are allowed both personal and social liberation. And perhaps the fakiri also is a kind of a safety issue for them. So being a fakir, being a woman who is in saffron, protects them from the usual attacks on women that could happen in that society. So perhaps they were, we want to question the question. We don't want to question that they were very sincerely searching for moksha. But the point is, which came first? Did they attempt moksha because they wanted domesticity, or was rejection of domesticity it was it just an excuse to reject the domestic? So which is first? We can't make out, because they both go hand in hand. And that's what I want to emphasize in this talk of mine, that for women, social and mystical liberation are intertwined. And it happens in case of almost all the saints of India. To reject the domestic is a way to go into the spiritual. Because as long as a woman is bound inside the domestic, her body becomes primary. For other people, for men also, liberation is necessary. You need to leave the family and go. You need to give up the responsibility. But once men are out of the responsibility, their body is no longer domestic. But the woman's body as a reproductive individual is always domestic. Because at any moment of time, a man may say, you are a fertile person, I am going to make you my wife, and your Stri Dharma is to reproduce. So the weightage of Stri Dharma as one of reproductive individual keeps her bound to the domestic. And a rejection of that happens if she's a widow or she goes away. The stories of these women tell us of how they were able to reject the reproductive body or reject the body of their own and move into the next phase of social and spiritual liberation. So the question that also comes up is, therefore, are women essentially or contingently capable of liberation as men? And the question that always comes is, why are we even asking that question? Obviously, liberation is supposed to be open for everyone. But it looks like when we study the stories of these women, that liberation was available, but only at the cost of their rejecting the domestic life, their rejection of the body. And women rejected the body through various ways. And I will take two case studies. So women's bodies, they have two social bodies. One is the body that is the reproductive body. And then there's a social body which has to take care of the family and be a mother, a sister, a brother. That is one that what we call in Tamil Sangam literature, Patini Pen, or we can say Pativrata Stri, or you can say Grihini. These are the epithets of the first social, where the woman is following her Stri Dharma. She's taking care of everything. Maitreyi in the beginning is like that. But then there is the other, even Meera also has to reject that and come out. But there's the other view of the woman, the second social of the woman as a seductress, as somebody who can seduce people and who craves and desires sex, who is sort of this beautiful woman who attracts men, who is supposed to preserve her chastity. So there's this two images of women which keep clashing. Sometimes they're in the same woman, sometimes they are in different phases of people's life. There is the really, even in case of Draupadi, the seductress Draupadi and the Draupadi who's the Pativrata, though married to 5 husbands. The story of the preceding woman who was married to 7 husbands. There was another story there in the Mahabharata in one of the renderings. The story of the seductress, the young woman saint whose body is so attractive that she is thrown out of the ashram and told that you're a distraction for other Swamijis, so please go out. The statement of the Buddha that if women come into the Sangha, it will end before 1,000 years. All these respond to the social of the woman as a seductress, as a body that is desirable and a body that is reproductive. So the social of the women is so much tied to their body, even more than the domestic duties. I guess even only in case of Sakkubai, you have the domestic duties being more important than the body. In the conversation, the discourse. But most of the time when you look at women and liberation, these two socials are colliding with each other. The seductress woman and the Stri Dharma woman, the Patini Pen and the seductress woman, as we call it, the Amrapali image. So women's body, so liberation has to come at the cost of rejecting the body. Both the social and the seductress body have to be rejected for the women to achieve liberation. And the liberation is dual, because when the woman is liberated from her body image or her body social, she is both liberated as a woman and also gets spiritual access. So I'm just taking today I will just talk about two of the women. Of course, we can do this work on almost all the women philosophers and look at this framework of the two socials or the two body socials for all the women. So Karakalamaya is called the mother who walked with her hands. And I call this story of hers as adaptive liberation. Um, the so The first thing that happens in case of the two body social is that in case of a grihastini or a grihini, there is a moment of theological moral dilemma. Be with your husband's family and be a good wife and mother, or reject all this and walk out. Meera has this dilemma, Akka has this dilemma, Karakalamaya has this dilemma. So um, conflicts between love for one's deity and one's husband. It is the biggest conflict because Pativrata Dharma versus the Bhakti Dharma is a kind of a moral dilemma that all these women overcome. And the way they overcome it is not through the mind, because it's not about the woman wanting to reject it. The husband has to reject the woman. In case of Meera, he died. So it was sort of, she was a widow. So there was no demand on her. She could leave. But in case of Karakalamaya, she was married. And just in a brief, the story of Karakalamaya is a 6th century woman saint in Tamil Nadu. She is one of the Nayanars who is exalted, one of the 63 Nayanars in Tamil literature. She was her hagiography or her story is that she was a girl called Punidavati. She is very good, and this is a story of mangoes. Strangely, mangoes figure so much in our literature about liberation and enlightenment. So Punitavati was a big Shaiva devotee. She was very, very devoted to Lord Shiva, and she was married to a merchant in the same town called Paramadattan. And Paramadattan one day comes home and gives her 2 mangoes, which a traveler friend has brought from the distant lands, and says, keep this for my lunch and I will give it to you. Give it to me when I ask for it. And she puts the mangoes away, and Shiva Bhakta comes there and begs for those mangoes. And when he begs for those mangoes, he doesn't beg for mango, he comes and asks for food, sorry. And she gives him a mango. She says, there are 2, my husband should eat 1, I should give this saintly Shiva Bhakta 1 mango, and I will definitely, it is a good practice to serve the devotees of Shiva. And when Paramatatan comes back from lunch, he asks her for 1 mango, and he eats the mango. And then he says, where's the second mango? I think it's rather selfish of him. He should have given that second mango to his wife, but she didn't expect it. But very as self-centered husband, I guess, he said, where's the second mango? And Punitavati, being the Pativrata, doesn't want to tell him that, hey, I gave away the mango to the Shiva Bhakta who had come begging for food. She's distraught because her Patni Dharma is that she should have not done that without asking her husband's permission. And so there's a moral conflict. She goes to Shiva and cries before him and in her puja room and says, Shiva, please help me. And a divine mango appears in her hand. And she's very happy, and she goes and gives it to the husband. The husband eats the mango and he's very, very astonished that the taste of the mango is very different. It doesn't seem to be from his friend's mango. It is much more delicious. It's much more wonderful to eat. And he's suspicious, and he asks her, where did the second mango come from? And she's really worried and really stressed out, and she just blurts out the truth to him and says, I got this mango from Shiva, this happened. And he is like, immediately the first thing is he's skeptical. He says, it is not possible. Definitely you're doing something behind my back. And like all husbands, he says, where's the proof? Show me the proof. Show me the proof. And otherwise you're seeing somebody behind my back and he's giving you the mangoes. How can mangoes appear out of nowhere? It's not possible. It's not mystical. So Punitavati just says, he says, if you're a true devotee of Shiva, I want to see another mango appear in your hands. And apparently she prays and Shiva makes a mango up. She says, he's suspecting my chastity, which is karpakarasi, right? Karpa is a very important chastity for the domestic patini pen or the pativrata. And the mango appears in her hand. And when Paramadatan tries to touch it, he disappears. She says, you ask God for only to see the fruit, not to eat it. So only one fruit is yours, others is not. He gets totally flabbergasted that his wife is a greater devotee of Shiva and she can make mangoes appear. And like a very typical insecure husband, he falls at her feet and says, I cannot think of you as my wife anymore. You've become a saint. And she cries and she says, I still love you. I am a good domestic wife. Don't do this. But Paramadatan sort of goes out of the house and disappears from her life. She's left alone. She's abandoned. And he goes to another town and sets up. He says, he sends message that he's got a business deal and he has to go to this other town. He goes to the other town and sets up a new family, marries another girl, a normal, non-worldly girl, as he calls her, and lives with her. And here Punitavati is waiting for him, and then they find out that he is settled down in the other time. So all the relatives of Punitavati decide that it's okay if there's a second wife, what is there? You should stay with your husband. And so they put her in a beautiful jewelry, bedecked jewelry, and take her to that town. Paramadatan, who hears that his wife is coming into town as his bride, actually brings a whole contingent of people saying that she's a saint and she's a mother. And so he and his wife and all carry these puja articles. And as soon as a pallaki comes down and she steps out of it, they all fall at her feet. And that is the most insult a wife can get as a pativrata, that your husband is falling at your feet. And so she gets so embarrassed. She gets into such a big moral dilemma. She says, she calls to Shiva and says, uh, take away this form, make me into a ghoul, make me into a preta, turn me into a preta, take away this peya kividu. Pay is the word for preta or a dead person. Make me into a ghoul, a ghost, one of those. You can imagine that whole take away the beauty. And Shiva granted her wish. And she went and stayed in a smashana. She became a total devotee of Shiva. And she goes to a place called Tiruvalankatte, and there she attains liberation. She's supposed to have gone. She says she goes to Kailas. She says, I will not walk on my feet there. And she has apparently walked on her hands. So they call her the mother who walked with her hands. I call this adaptive liberation because in order to get her freedom from her domestic situation, it's also God's will, in some sense, all this drama of the mango. But the whole, even if you don't believe in the mysticism, it sort of says that what is required for her to become a full devotee of Shiva is actually a disfigurement of her body. She has to stop being the seductress. So here you find both of things happening. On one hand, her body is made into a ghoul, which means it's no longer sexually accessible by any man. She's no longer the seductress. And on the other hand, her domestic rejection by the husband throws her out. And she's asked not to be a wife by the husband himself. In Meera's case also, the husband dies. So the domestic is rejected and the body or the seductress social is also rejected. And then you have the liberation of the mother. She sings this. This is her poem, Tirupathikam. And in Tirupathikam, she says, a female ghoul with withered breasts, bulging veins, hollow eyes, white teeth and two fangs, shriveled stomach, red hair, bony ankles, elongated shins, stays in the cemetery, howling angrily. This is the place where my Lord. So she describes herself like that. She says, I am that preta, I am that pay. So even her images are like that, that shriveled woman. And she says, so the whole point of the Tiruvattai Mamalai also has that, her poetry is like, her poetry becomes very bold. Her poetry says, give up your family life and go think of Shiva. So a very bold statement from a Patini pen who was so reluctant to even give up the mango who felt upset that she had given away the mango without permission, to this woman who is the saint, who's saying, give up your bondage, wife and children, leave up everything and go and take refuge in Shiva. So the whole idea of Karakalamaya therefore represents the rejection of the two body. I call it adaptive because the body first changes and then she gets her liberation. So it is adaptive. So first the body is there, then it changes, and then she goes on her spiritual journey, like the complete spiritual journey. There's a different kind of story of Akamahadevi. I've also pondered on why she is not Amma Mahadevi or Magalu Mahadevi, and she's only Akka. Why she's not daughter or mother? Because both the daughter and mother have duties. Akkas are somewhat dutyless, you know, the sisters are somewhat dutyless. So, or it might be the Kannada word Anna, Akka. It's very common. But I've also, it's my own imagination that Akkas have less duties than Ammas and Magalus or daughters. So in the case of Akamahadevi, we have a different kind of a transformation. The transformation is her board, as she first goes out in search of liberation. She rejects her domestic, so the domestic tyaga happens. And for people who are not aware, so Akka's story is that Akamahadevi's story is that she's married to a sort of a Jaina chieftain. Some places he's a king, some places he's a Jaina chieftain. And the rule that she says is, when I'm meditating on Shiva, you should not even, you should not approach me, you should not try and touch me when I'm doing my meditation and my practices. And she's a Sharana. She belongs to the Veerashaiva southern branch of Basavarna and the others. And she is one day she goes to the river bank and she's meditating in the wet clothes in the river in privacy. And this many times this Jain chieftain husband of hers irritates her, and one day she's like in a wet cloth, and seeing her in that wet cloth, he gets really enamored and he comes and touches her and tries to pull away her cloth. She just walks out of the cloth, and it's said that from that moment she says, I am not going to wear any cloth also. This also you can keep. And she walks away from that point saying, I'm not going to be with you anymore. There are a lot of stories about how she, so she becomes a Digambari. She becomes a naked ascetic. And that itself is a rejection of the body of the seductress. But her, on one hand, when she has rejected the social body where she is a seductress of the normal people and the gendered people looking at her as a woman, her own seduction moves or turns inwards towards Shiva. Because her whole attitude of seduction goes towards Shiva. She becomes Shiva's lover. She transforms the seductive body into, so it's a transformative liberation where her seductress body is given to loving Shiva. In fact, some of her Kudala Sangamadeva are quite explicit rhymes, right? I will just read out one. He says, "Oh Shiva, when shall I crush you on my pitcher breasts? Oh Kudala Sangamadeva, when do I, oh Channamallikarjuna, when do I join you? Stripped of the body's shame and heart's modesty." You can interpret it mystically. You can say it's all about rejecting the body and becoming Atmana Kare. It is a kind of a Atma trying to meet the Paramatma. You can do that, but the language is that of the body. It's an embodied language. Her whole seduction, her body is become a body meant for Shiva's enjoyment. And over time, what you find is there's a transformation in this. When it starts off with husband inside, lover outside, I cannot manage them, the world and the other, cannot manage them both. She's talking about that whole conflict that all our women saints underwent. That for me represents the dilemma of a woman's life. I mean, we still experience this dilemma in domestic life on one side and paper and PhD and office on the other. I cannot manage them both, the world and the other. Cannot manage them both. It is still true of us. We are managing two different worlds, but for Akka, it was the spiritual and the domestic which was clashing. And then slowly, as you read her poetry, you start to see how, from the point of view of becoming Shiva's lover, she transforms her body into the body of a kind of the same position as where there's a genderless body. The whole world became a woman. And she actually says there's this last moment of her life, last few days of her life, where she actually goes to the mantapa and to the sabha, to the audience of the great Sharanas, and there they ask her so many questions about, because she's been remaining naked, they ask her a lot of questions about purity, impurity, chastity. And she literally says, don't, don't ask me anymore. I am now one with my Channamallikarjuna. I'm one with Shiva. Please, how much will you ask me? Just let me go. I am in love with my Shiva. And her body transforms and she rejects the body. So in case of Karakalamaya, it was adaptive transformation of body. In case of Vakka, I believe it was a transformational liberation, where slowly, with lot of practice, the more spiritual and more closer to Shiva she got, the lesser the body became an impediment. So she first got the social liberation, and then her body liberation took a little more time. And she doesn't denigrate it. She just starts to ignore it and slowly develops into this wonderful union with her own Shiva. So in that sense, what do these women philosophers tell her? The women philosophers says the right to choose liberation collectively or individually must rest on the seeker of liberation and her context, and not on the emancipator. It doesn't matter for the women who their guru is, who their god is, which tradition they belong to. The choices that they make, collective choice and individual choice that they have made, actually causes liberation for them. And so what we have to look for in women's epistemology in Indian traditions is how they execute the moral dilemma of living between two duties. So the moral dilemma, dharma sankata, is something that they all handle. The second thing that they handle is how do they handle their body, the domestic body, the reproductive body, and the seductress body. And the third thing is how they make the choice, the free will that they have. And I think their free will and dissent have happened long before the dissent of other sections of marginalized society. And so they teach us the philosophy of dissent also. So with that, I end my talk and open it up for questions. I apologize if I've taken a little more time. Okay, for a moment, I thought I had disappeared from the teams.
Thank you so much. Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Professor Meera, for that insightful talk. Of course, we now open the floor for discussion. So if you have any questions for Professor Meera, I think there's a hand for Professor Meera. Yes, Meera, ma'am, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Meera. That was a very, very interesting presentation. Really enjoyed every bit of it. And so you talked about all this mysticism attached to, and exactly what I wanted to speak about even in those 5 minutes that Srini gave me in the beginning. He said 5 minutes, so I couldn't speak much. But exactly what I felt is how about all these myths and mysticism that is surrounding these women philosophers. How much of it is probably true, or the legend making as a social project, or was it more like a social project? Because especially when it comes to Akamahadevi, we generally Akka we see, so Harihara writes about Akamahadevi Akkana Ragale in 12th century, and then Shunya Sampadana in 14th and 15th century, and then Mahadevi Akkana Purana 1550, and then of course Prabhulingali. There are so many other things that follow. And all those four, if you see, they carry very different and slightly different stories of Akka's life. So how about was this making a legend of out of their lives more like a social project, basically to protect the patriarchy? Because the thinking individual, a thinking woman, was very difficult for the society to take at that point in time. So how much? So do you see this kind of legends as mostly as constructions, and how do you see that?
Yeah. Thank you, Nita. Very important question, because that's why I said when men are reporting about women, what I hope is, despite the censorship of men in their writing, I'm hoping that they wouldn't be able to remove the fact that Akka was walking around naked. They would actually say it's bad or it's wrong, or whatever. They wanted to give any lecture about it, or they will give explanations for it. But they were not able to stop. All four versions will have this whole idea of her being an avaduta, right? A person who's not walking with clothes around. So in that sense, one of the ways to read hagiographies or texts, feminist reading, is called hermeneutics of suspicion. It's been followed by Adrian Rich and other people. So when we look at texts about women, we already are suspicious of patriarchy. And if we approach these texts with this suspicion, it is not suspicion which says is what is being said true or false, but we are suspecting the patriarchal bias in this text. So we want to ask the question, what? So we want to look at it very carefully. So perhaps what we can do is we cannot actually go back and find out if it was true or not. But what we can do is dialogue with the text. We can take the four versions and then compare them maybe and see them which text seems to be the most generous. For example, between the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, Mahabharata is more generous to women's voices, right? They might have changed the grammar of the question. Like, for instance, the way I talked about Maitreyi, the Upanishad doesn't tell us that she was managing Yajnavalkya's ashram. We have to guesstimate that from the life of the social. So in some sense, we have to rely on technical, historical sources of that time. So what was the status of women in those times? And even women scholars in history also have the same trouble because nobody talks about what the queens were doing. We know what all the kings were doing, and except when they were fought over by two armies, we hardly know what the queens were doing. And we hope that as we start to reread these texts, looking for the queens, looking for the political in Meera, looking for the rebellion in Akka, we will start to find, we will sort of we will deepen our study and their understanding. But unfortunately for us, it is very, very hard to find a non-patriarchal story of these women. And I feel one of the places where this goes is in Lokagate, in Lok Sangeet, in normal poetry. For example, in the retelling of the Ramayana, if you'll remember, the Ramayana of the Telugu folk songs, they actually talk about Sita's life as a daughter-in-law, but they use their own lives to model Sita. So Rama gets upset with Sita because she's working in the house, and then when she goes, he's locked his door, and then she goes to Kausalya and tells her to make Rama open the door. So that is the story of the Telugu woman poet. But she makes this song up for Sita. So in some sense, it is both the Sita of the Telugu woman poet's life as well as the Sita of Ramayana, who might have had a situation like that. So I think part imagination, part extension. So here, truth epistemology will not work, but hermeneutics of suspicion and a feminist imagination is only going to help us, particularly when it comes to studying older texts. But we imagine that the life of women has not changed much. So obviously, when your mother-in-law is telling you that Ratri 10 gante mel horage hogbeda, don't go out after 10 o'clock, obviously Meera's mother-in-law would have said, don't go out after dark to the bhajan or puja, right? Don't dance in front of public. That would have been an instruction. So we can guesstimate that this is the social they would have lived under. But their poetry is free, because no man can write poetry of emotion the way women can. So from their poetry, we are able to understand their life. So it's best to study their composition and then get their life from that, rather than just read the life stories. So their poetry becomes our source. So even if the poetry has been written down by men, I'm hoping that they were respectful enough of the Bhakti movement not to change too much in it. Of course, if the women was using bad words or saying something very, we don't know if Akamahadevi ever swore at the men. We don't know if she was giving them gali. Her language is very beautiful. I think that one who has so much bhakti in her heart will not be cruel, because the language is one of beauty and love. So I'm hoping that she doesn't, she's the way we imagine her to be. But we can only hope. We cannot certainly say this is it. But somewhere we have to begin. And this is a big entry path. And so hopefully I hope that one day we'll discover these texts which were hidden somewhere because they were women's texts, and we can start reading them again.
Thank you, Nita ma'am, for the question. Meera ma'am, if I may ask a question to you. So in the beginning, you spoke about this need for rejection of the domestic. But do you think that this is, let's say, an option or an opportunity that is available only for a certain, let's say, privileged class of women? And what about the ones that probably do not have this sort of privilege, let's say, to reject the domestic? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's possible for even women who are not inside because women themselves as a caste or class belong across the whole range of, for example, the theories, right? The Buddhist nuns, the Jaina nuns. There's a huge lot of work that we can do on the Buddhist and the Jaina nuns. There is Vahina Bai in Maharashtra. They were domestic and Sakubai, right? They were domestic and still they achieved liberation. But the stories keep telling us that the domestic overwhelms the spiritual quest. That is why Krishna himself had to come and grind the grains. That story may not be true that Krishna came to grind the grains and allow Sakubai to visit Pandharpur. But the stories again and again tell us that the woman's place is in the domestic. So perhaps it's the patriarchy that makes it feel that it was like they didn't want to tell the stories of these women without saying that they had to reject the domestic. Like, तुम्हें liberation चाहिए, so you have to get rid of your children and your husband. So was it like a warning that this is what is required? But I don't think so, because even for men, rejection of the domestic is normal for spiritual liberation. Tyaga comes before, right? Sannyasa comes before. But what we can also see is that it's not only the privileged, because in the Bhakti movement is where we find all sections of the society rejecting. I think the safety of the woman was more problematic in case of the so-called lower class of society, because if you were in the Dalit section of society, your bodily security was not available. So if you walked off and went off, I think you were more available to be enslaved by anybody, right? Whereas some of these women were more privileged, so they could not be made slaves or could not be kidnapped, right? So obviously nobody would touch Meera. She's a Rajput princess. I'm not sure whether she went around wandering alone. I'm sure it was like a collective. And so women's collective, if a whole group of women decide to be collectively liberated, I think like the theories, then I think it works. Otherwise, it's very difficult for women to domestic liberation is necessary. The way the domestic people sometimes say you can be in your house and take care of your children and still get moksha. I don't think we just have time. The domestic is all-consuming, laundry, cooking, everything. It's at least still we have, even our washing machines take time to run. So I think it is not just, people think of it as labor. It's not labor, it's supervision. And supervision takes a lot of time. Even if you have 100 servants working for you, you have to supervise each and every one of them. So the domestic doesn't consist of only, washing vessels and cooking for the family. It is a full-time chief executive officer work. So I think it is somewhat, that's what they're saying. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Meera ma'am. I think we have another question by Sonia. Hello from Sonia, MCH student.
Yes, it's MCH Sonia.
Okay.
Hello.
Go ahead, Rita.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. Thank you, Meera, for this very interesting talk. My question or rather comment, and you can tell me how to think about this. Your talk made me really think about not just about the absence of women philosopher and just the fact that, as such a large field and such an ancient field is kind of really devoid of, it's not really devoid in terms of its presence, but the devoid of our knowledge of, women philosophers, or in that sense, spiritual leaders. Now, even when we talk about spirituality for that matter, when we talk of meditation, when we talk of yoga philosophy, again the kind of the Purusha and the Prakriti kind of structure that we have in order to reach liberation. I think that itself, the language of that itself is very much uh, I don't know if it's male centric or male dominated. At least, the Prakriti is always the Sankhya and the distraction and everything around you, and the Purusha is the self and the man, and so the language of just this path to liberation itself is kind of flawed, or kind of not uh, gender neutral, like how you're pointing out, right? So then for us, like as contemporary thinkers, and even to some extent all of us wanting to at least get a taste of liberation or meditate, how can we are in our own understanding think of our own personal spiritual journey, keeping in mind the fact that we are a woman? Because I find it very highly conflicted, especially the Bhagavad Gita. And when you go for these yoga camps and learn yoga, it is all about the man, it is all about the Purusha, it is all about anicca, but that anicca somewhere has everything which is in the language, and even in the the kind of activities are very male centric. So then how does one come to think of it? Unless Akamahadevi and Guru Ma and couple of others that you have mentioned, they all were able to reach that, but how many of us are actually keeping them as ideals? Or we are still having Ramana Maharishi, and still have these people as our sort of liberating gurus, right? So we don't really have an image or a an imagination of a woman liberator as such. So yeah, anything on that?
Yeah, I think it is very. With yoga, with Sankhya, the issue was that I think I shocked Larson. Gerald Larson had come, who's the Sankhya scholar from abroad. He's a very famous Sankhya scholar. He had come to NIAS and he said, there's a particular example in Sankhya which was very gendered for me, and it kind of irritated the feminist inside me. So the story is that the Purusha is watching a theater and Prakriti is dancing for him, and the Purusha is unattached, and the day he stops watching her, he will be liberated. So there's a kind of a gendered language in Sankhya. There are a lot of papers on it. It is true. I guess what the people of those days did is they just reflected their social, right? Their social was that of the Purusha and the Prakriti. So there's an engendered language, but technically speaking, Purusha means the person in the city of the body, or the nine-hold city. So Pure Shayati iti Purushaha, the one who's sleeping in the city. So in that sense, it is the witness consciousness. Prakriti is Jada. But because of the gendering of the words that they use for it, whether it's the rivers or the mountains or the lakes, there's a kind of essentialism that goes in. One of the pathways that I find is Buddhist pathways are not gendered because they don't focus on essential properties, right? And among our liberation also, Advaita also doesn't focus, Advaita and Dvaita don't focus so much on the gender. But in yoga, it is true that I keep telling people that Surya Namaskar is not meant for women because we actually cannot do Sashtanga Namaskar. When we do Sashtanga Namaskar, our Hridaya, our heart doesn't touch the ground. So that whole position of Sashtanga, we do the folded knee namaskaram, right? We get into our Vajrasana and then we put our head on we do a Bhumi Namaskara, our forehead touches the ground, which is very interesting because yoga is so much taught by male people that even women learn female yoga. Particularly the men are they don't know what periods are, and they tell you not to do yoga during your periods. And that is because they understand very little about it. And there are actually yogasanas which can get rid of your menstrual cramps. So what you have to do is to go back to the original text, the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, the Hatha Yoga Tantra, and actually see what the original texts of yoga say for your own practice. And that would give you an opening into because the yoga texts are very clear, because there are yogas to be performed during pregnancy, the yogas to be performed, not to be performed, which is not the purity, impurity, woman's body, reproductive body kind of yoga. Second, with our medical knowledge, we can definitely find out much more if we collaborate with our so-called Western medicine people, they will tell us whether these are actually going to harm us or not. And we can make our own yoga. We can make women's yoga. There's Kali Ray Yoga. She actually advocates certain asanas during periods and pregnancy, which actually empower the woman and make her more powerful. A lot of nonsense that the patriarchal gurus spout about not going to the temple because there are magnetic things that bring down the energy of a woman, and all these are all patriarchal, meant to keep women inside the house and not be in the public space. So we have to be, as modern feminists, we have to be modern in some way and reject the parts of the pre-modern that don't appeal to us. I think like those women rejected their contemporary, that's the point, right? Meera rejected her contemporary practice of sati and did not perform sati. She rejected her contemporary practice. That means I, as this Meera now, have to reject my contemporary practice, not reject sati. Sati is her social. I have to reject my social. A social that says women philosophers should be like this, or women philosophers always, no, in North I come here, the sindoor is so important, like sindoor rakho. So much so, some of the women bring dabbas to the house and wash their face and they keep the sindoor. I don't keep anything. Sometimes one bindi, yeah, for fun, but I don't see it so important to keep that on top of my hair. But so I reject that social. I don't want that. So in my own little ways, we rebel against what is our social. And I think that is the way these women have shown. And for your second part of the question, yes, maybe we should rewrite Sankhya. So what I shocked Gerald Darson with is, I told him that why should Purusha get fed up of watching Prakriti? Prakriti will just stop dancing for him. She is fed up of dancing. So it's Prakriti moksha and not Purusha moksha. She has to be kind enough to stop dancing, and only then he'll get moksha. He got shocked. He says, that is not Sankhya. That is not what is written in Sankhya Karika. But that is a feminist rereading of Sankhya. It's possible to do that with the new philosophies of with deconstruction and postmodern thought and Deleuze and all of that. We use the tools and power that we have in modern philosophy to actually hit back and change this ancient text into a sort of, we're redoing the whole thing from a different viewpoint. Traditional scholars will say, no, it is not possible, but we don't want to keep that philosophy frozen. We want to make it inclusive. We want to make it contemporary. And that is an assault, but it's an assault which will be better done rather than, it's an assault for the positive, for the inclusive. It's not an assault which will degrade the philosophy, but it'll actually upgrade it. So we need to deconstruct the old classical philosophy and reconstruct it back so it accommodates our new machine. It's like breaking down your old kitchen, taking out the chula and making a place for microwave. That's not wrong, right? Yeah, I think.
Thank you so much, Meera ma'am. I think that was a very strong message that you gave out to all the men and women here present here, and all of us need to reject some element of this social movement. Ma'am, you have something to say, Meera ma'am?
No, I think, no, sorry, my mistake. It was, please go.
So I think we have two more questions. So one by Richa, and Srini, I'll come to you next. Richa, please go ahead and pose your question.
Yeah, thanks, Priya. Thank you, Dr. Meera. That was very interesting and full of packed with information. Thank you so much for it. So my question is like a genuine doubt that I have that I would like you to clear. So the investigation that you want to follow, and when you talk about all these women poets, these poet philosophers who had to reject the domestic life and almost a violent rejection of domestic life. There was no, apart from a few examples, there was no balance for them to attain their moksha or liberation in the different forms of liberation that you have pointed out, be it adaptive or be it transformative. So do you, as a philosopher, see that any kind of liberation, however you would call it, is perhaps not possible without this absolute, almost violent rejection of domestication, of domestic life? Or do you see, do you want to contest or really explore the idea of liberation itself that requires women to, just reject this form of life, or perhaps a way of life that many of us might want to choose, might want to negotiate with, but any kind of liberation an ideal form of it, but be it any the forms you point out in. An ideal liberation would perhaps entail an absolute and violent destruction of the urge of having a domestic life, or the very phenomenon of domestic life.
Yeah. So thank you, Richa. That's an important question, which brings me to the point that the domestic that they have to reject is already patriarchal. It's what the feminists say, home is the center of violence, right? Home becomes the home that we currently have, the current contemporary domestic that we have is completely patriarchal. Because if there is another kind of domestic, if there's a kind of a domestic where the husband and wife are equal partners, and let's say it's a Yajnavalkya kind of, even in case of Yajnavalkya, it seems like he is leaving behind her and going away to take sannyas or do his tapas. He is not saying, I will take half of your work and then you meditate for the half day and I will meditate for the half day. He's saying, I'll dump the whole thing in your hand and go. So the domestic is already patriarchal. So when I say rejection of the domestic, it's not even the rejection of the domestic as a space and a place, which some of them choose to do, like Akka and Meera. They all seem to leave. Okay, because I guess the whole home, if the home is not something that is in your house. The home is in your office. When your pallu is not all right, it's your office that tells you your pallu is not all right. It's the domestic space in our heads. It's a domestic mentality which is so much controlled by patriarchal and misogyny. It's the domestic which says women have to look beautiful in a conference. It's the domestic that tells us that if if somebody else's child is crying, you have to take care of it. I mean, if you notice, this is something very funny. I have written a poem about it. The 5,000-year-old woman inside me, in a whole meeting, when somebody coughs, my hand reaches for the water bottle first to give them the water. The domestic has been ingrained into me from my childhood. Serve, serve, serve. So to sit back and not take meeting notes, to sit back and expect a male peon to come and serve you, a male attendant to come and serve you tea, takes a kind of a masculinity. You have to put on a false masculinity. Is there an alternative feminine, an alternative domestic? We can dream of it, but right now that's not the reality. So the rejection of the domestic is not just rejection of your home and house, but a rejection of, we can talk, if we call up all the women PhD scholars who are married and talk to them, they're also trying to achieve some kind of liberation. Let's not go there to the moksha level, right? All of them are just doing their theses. And if you talk to them and collect their stories in an ethnographic way, you will understand how many chai bartans they had to burn, including me, in order to finish writing the PhD on time, right? So that is something every woman who is trying to achieve something in the level of social or when I say spiritual liberation, it need not be moksha. It can also be self-actualization, your realization of your talent, your potential. Every business owner, every PhD aspirant, every pilot, every person who is trying to, very strangely, philosopher women are also few, chefs are also few in women, very few women chefs. Even when they have to, so even to become a chef, they have to reject the domestic cooking in order to become a chef. It's very strange. So I think as women, philosophers will lead the way, and I think other people will follow. When we are able to do this in one level, I think it will start, domino effect will be there in all areas. I think we have to lead the way in the head.
Thank you.
Thank you, Meera ma'am. Srini, you had a question, but if it's okay, because I do had a question and lest I forget it, is it okay if I go ahead first before I ask you to ask her a question? Okay, he says yes. Ma'am, something that you just said, you spoke about how this domesticity, but basically this domestic is the patriarchy, and it's so ingrained in all of us as individuals. How do we go about unlearning it from us, separating it from us? Is rejection and rebelling the only way to, let's say, come out of this domesticity that we talked about? What is the solution to it?
So there is two way. One, when we talk of rebellion and when we talk of protest, it seems like we are like this Hindi film serial women who say nahi. That's not the protest. It's a dissent. It's a refusal, which is social. It is like everybody. It's a. In fact, men have taught us this. Men have taught us satyagraha, right? So it's a kind of a satyagraha you have to hold. But before you reject, you have to recognize. So most people end up thinking that if I'm a feminist, I will not, cook. Saying I'm not going to cook. The point is not that you're not going to cook. The point is you make the choice to cook. The default cook in the house is the woman. So if you stop being the default, it's like the default MC of any program in in MCES is not a woman, right? It's given by turn. The default in olden days, it was very strange in MCPH itself. Myself and Gayatri suddenly realized the default note taker in every meeting is either me or her or a woman. Then we stopped and we said it is going by turn to all members of the faculty, not just me or her. Right? So the first step in any dissent is to recognize patriarchy where you see one. And the simplest way to do it is to have non-gendered roles. Right? Always, why should a woman sing Vandana, Ganesh Vandana? Why can't we have a lovely male voice singing Ganesh Vandana? So every gendered role. And now that we have the third gender and the proliferance of gendered and binary itself is not there. I think gendered roles themselves, I think when we stop having the patriarchal roles for women, we'll also stop having patriarchal roles for the third gender. They also will be freed up. So then it's gender neutral roles. It's a work that has to be done. Whoever can do it. We are no longer lifting boulders and, I don't know, whatever they were doing that. It's not about lifting roles. But I'm very shocked in the North, this patriarchal dialogue is much more harsher than in the South. I've started to notice, or maybe because I'm brought up in Bangalore and I've never seen the rural, really rural kind of idea. And now I'm experiencing the amount of patriarchy. I'm actually living with my support staff who have to wear full face ghungat at home in the village. And they're walking on the roads with a full face ghungat. They can't see in front of them. And so I'm actually coming to face with what I'd read in books as a part of the everyday experience. And I'm just thinking if I just can get, that's why that song is very famous in North. Ghungat utha ke kudi nu nachne de. Let the woman dance without her ghungat. I never realized that's a very important liberation song for these women here. So that is something. So rebellion need not be like, some sort of violent rebellion. And if we did that, we would be the same as the men. We would be patriarchal. Because violence is patriarchal. So dissent is a better way. Like I check out.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think the need for degendering practices in our own life is a long debate here, and I will go on for time. I think I'll ask Srini. You had a question. I'm so sorry that I took the floor before you. Please go ahead and ask your question to Meera ma'am.
Really, thank you, Meera. You crowned the event, and I'm really happy you partnered, and then your lecture was really, really enlightening. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk.